Mrs. Eddy by Hugh Studdert Kennedy. Chapter 1. A New England Ancestry. The long life of Mary Baker Eddy extended from 1821 to 1910. Times have changed since 1910, so that looking back upon those years seems like looking back upon the age of innocence. It was an age when the tempo of life was still unhurried, when a bicycle was still, for the most part, the fastest thing on the road, certainly in New Hampshire, where in and out of the hills the roads wound, narrow ribbon strips of white amidst the green. And no man thought of traffic save when he thought of the great city and its busy streets. Oxen plowed the fields, and the moving picture was still something for the small town boy who had gone to the big town to tell about on his return. But if New Hampshire of 30 years ago represented an unaccustomed scene, the New Hampshire of 100 years before that was in another world, not so much in the outward and visible sign as in the inward and spiritual grace. The New Hampshire of 1910 had a century of peace behind her. On both sides of the Atlantic, men and women were beginning to talk of how best might be celebrated the great fact that for nearly 100 years no strife had risen between the two great branches of the English-speaking peoples, and New Hampshire, in common with the rest of the country, was taking part in the discussion. It was very different in the New Hampshire of 1821 when our record opens. The War of 1812 was still a vivid memory. The War of the Revolution, not so long past, but that fathers who had fought in it and mothers who had waded through it could be telling the story once again to their children's children. New Hampshire had been in the midst of it all. Running up, as it does, to the Canadian frontier, the Granite State, as it came to be called, early learned the stern realities of war and that demand for watchfulness which is the price of liberty. The French wars, the Indian wars, swept through her valleys, and among the earliest recollections of the child, Mary Baker, must have been the story of how her great-great-grandfather, Captain John Lovewell, lost his life in a desperate struggle with the Indians at Lovewell's Fight, and of how General John McNeill, cousin of her venerable grandmother, was the hero of the Battle of Chippewa in the War of 1812. By 1821, the noise of war had died away in the distance, but the men and women of those days had known about it, and the hills and the vales and the meeting houses, even the trees, had their tales to tell. Life was hard and rugged. In winter, it was a constant struggle with the elements. In the spring and summer, with the soil. The winters in New Hampshire are winters indeed. From the day that the first snowflake drifts aimlessly down to a frost-bound earth early in November, well on into April, winter has it all its own way. The magic of October, with its fourth fairing of unbelievable color, gives way to the lighter glory of November. The crimson and the orange and the purple merge gently into the pale gray and gold. And then one day, as Longfellow has it, out of the bosom of the air, out of the cloud folds of her garments shaken, over the woodlands brown and bare, over the harvest field forsaken, silent and soft and slow descends the snow. Thence onwards it snows hard and often. There are days of splendor with the sun shining from a cloudless sky. Then there is more snow until stone wall and fence have vanished and roads are no more, and even the houses seem to have pulled white sheets and blankets around them. And cold. Whittier knew all about it, and in his Snowbound has left an ineffaceable picture of a New England winter and how it was met in a New England home 100 years ago. A chill, no coat, however stout, of homespun stuff could quite shut out. His story, as presented in Snowbound, was the winter story of any farm in New Hampshire, when, after a night and a day and a night of storm and snow, nothing is left of the familiar landscape. No cloud above and no earth below, just sky and snow everywhere, with all familiar sights taking on strange shapes. But the work of the farm had to go on. Paths had to be dug through the drifts. Wood had to be brought in. Stalls had to be littered. Hay had to be pitchforked down from the hay loft for the cows. The horses had to have their corn. Milking, skimming, churning had to go on. And at night the women folk had still their spinning and weaving and knitting to do. In vivid contrast to all this was the spring and summer. Those accustomed to the gradual, almost imperceptible oncoming of spring in milder climates can have no idea of the sudden burst of trumpets which heralds spring in New England. For weeks, underneath, the snow has been going. Outwardly, all is much the same, but underneath the warm blanket of the snow, the soil has been quickening with countless sturdy growths. Then suddenly, all nip and eagerness seem to vanish from the air. What breeze there is mild and warm. And in a day or two, the melting snow reveals a world of life well on its way. Lush new green is suddenly everywhere, and each morning finds a new phalanx of wild flowers in the woods and by the brooks. Soon it is high summer. The setting was the same 100 years ago, but in those days the machine age was still a long way off, and the farmer and his hired men went forth to their work, in the morning until the evening, in a very real sense. Indeed, work, hard work, to which no limit was set or expected, was a characteristic of everyday life. There were few pleasures as the present world understands them, but in their places was the glamour of the pioneer life, with its opportunity to wrest something new from the earth every day, and the vision of a new country, like a growing child, coming daily into fulfillment. In the soul of the New Englander, there was a passionate joy in thrift, and in the visible achievements of his own hands. The digging up of another tree stump, The reclaiming of another acre of land gave a zest to the days and a deep-toned content to his night's sleep. The life was, and had to be, tremendously self-contained. In a large household, and many of them were very large, there had to be a large measure of organization. With a great multiplicity of things to do, everyone had to perform his part faithfully, and the efficient housewife had a place and a time for everything. And her daughters and hired girls, often the daughters of neighboring households, had to be faithful. A bright cleanliness was characteristic at all times, but especially in summer. Open doors and open windows, with well-scrubbed tubs and churns drying in the sun, and everywhere a sense of brightness and light. So it was, no doubt, on July 16th, 1821, when Mary Baker was born in Bow, New Hampshire, a little township 4 miles south of Concord, the state capital. Mark Baker, her father, lived on his own farm in an upland tract of some 500 acres, which had been cleared by his father and elder brother. For 6 generations there had been Bakers in New England. The first immigrant was one John Baker, who, as the records show, was a freeman of Charlestown in 1634. He came from Kent, where his people had for generations been substantial yeomen in the parish of Lyminge. Lyminge is not far from Folkestone, and the low square tower of the old parish church was a landmark on the way to the coast when Edward I was king. The first baker of whom anything is known is one Robert, a native of Lyminge, whose life's span spread itself over the greater part of the 15th century. Of his long story, nothing is known for certain save one thing. When he lay a-dying, and bethought him of the things he had done or left undone, he made provision in his will that 12 pence be paid to the church for tithes forgotten, another 12 pence for the maintenance of the church building, and a bushel of wheat to all the lights of the said church. Perhaps it may be too much to picture from this an all too scrupulous honesty, combined with a deep religious feeling, and a strong sense of public spirit and responsibility. And beyond this, a fundamental generosity, which lay, however, so deeply buried under the demands of thrift and care, that it only emerged when these demands had been fully met. Be this as it may, such a fashion of a man might well be held as a composite picture of all the Bakers. So they were in Kent, and so they were when they crossed the Atlantic and settled on the New England seaboard. The next baker in succession in Lyminge was John, the son of Robert. It is possible that his father's tardy payment of tithe represented an incipient rebellion against the demands of the church, which only approaching death could reverse. But whatever the father's attitude, there can be no doubt about the son's. He openly flouted the ecclesiastical demands by attempting to administer his wife's estate without paying tax to the church. He was tried and condemned, condemned to march before the procession in church on 2 Sundays, clad only in ragged shirt and breeches, bearing a lighted candle worth a penny. There is more than a little reason to conclude, especially from the penance imposed upon him, that John Baker was a Lollard. The teachings of Wycliffe, in spite of all that ecclesiastical authority could do to suppress them, had spread steadily through England. Wycliffe's poor teachers went everywhere. Carrying portions of the newly translated Bible with them, they constantly did mingle among the poor, and found great favor with them. So much was this case, and so strong did feeling run, that in the early years of the 15th century, in many places, processions were abandoned, and the worship on saints' days ceased to be observed. The abandonment of the procession, such an integral part of pre-Reformation worship, was a specially sore point with the ecclesiastical authority. And when renewed persecution had resulted in its inevitable flood of recantations, one of the first signs of the return of orthodoxy was the restoration of the procession, and one of the favorite penances imposed on repentant heretics was to walk in it. John Baker's was evidently a particularly bad case, for he not only had to walk in the procession, but to do so with contumely and discredit. He did not resist to the point of martyrdom, as did so many, but he must have gone much further than his fellows to be placed, as he was, at the forefront of the procession. In any event, whatever may be thought of Robert's forgetfulness in the matter of tithes, or John's contumacy in the matter of taxes, there can be no doubt as to the open rebellion of their descendant in the 4th generation, one John Baker, who, after much discussion and earnest persuasion, by which he refused to be exorcised, was finally excommunicated as an obdurate separatist. That was in 1634. Some 4 years previously, the Great Migration to the New World had begun. The Massachusetts Bay Company was chartered in 1629. In sharp contrast with the little company of settlers, humble farmers, laborers, and artisans, long immortalized as the Pilgrim Fathers, who had landed on the bleak shores of Cape Cod 9 years before, the new company was a magnificent enterprise. The Plymouth colony was an outlawed religious band. In the eyes of Orthodox England, its members were contemptible troublemakers. In the opinion of the Bishop of London, they were men of no account, instructed by guides fit for them, cobblers, tailors, felt makers, and such like trash. On the other hand, the Bay Colony was literally a cross-section of English society, transferred bodily to the New World. All strata, with the exception of the peerage, were represented. Not a few possessed large landed estates in England. Some were wealthy merchants. Others were prominent men of learning. On the roll of the company were such names as Sir John Young, Sir Richard Saltonstall, John Endicott, John Winthrop, and many other well-known landowners and men of substance. The great mass of the new colonists, however, were yeoman farmers and freeholders from east and southeastern England. And they came with their livestock, their tools, with great stores of supplies and goods for trading with the Indians. Above all, they brought with them the established church. They were not separatists in the strict sense of the word, although Orthodox England may so have regarded them. They greatly desired that the English form might be purified, but they did not say on leaving England, as did the separatists, "Farewell, Babylon, farewell, Rome," but rather, in the words of one of them, "Farewell, dear England. Farewell, the Church of God in England and all the Christian friends there." It was to a ship's company setting out for this New England that John Baker attached himself after his excommunication at Lyminge. Meanwhile, throughout all the years stretching back into centuries, 4 other families, afterwards destined to come together, were moving from one generation to another in England: the Ambroses of Suffolk, the Goodhues of Kent, the Chandlers of Hertfordshire, and the Lovejoys from Buckinghamshire. Weavers and millers, candle makers, blacksmiths, people of much solid worth, who about the same time and for the same reason as did John Baker of Lyminge, decided to throw in their lot with the Massachusetts Company and seek a larger freedom in the New World. Henry Ambrose, Nicholas Goodhue, John Lovejoy, and William Chandler all set out on the great adventure about the same time. Of the ways and means of John Baker's journey, nothing is known. What time of the year or hour of the day he left the little village where his people had lived and labored for so long, who, if anyone, went with him, where he took ship, and who were his companions on the voyage, there is no record. When next we meet John Baker, he is a freeman of Charlestown, a little settlement on the other side of the Charles estuary from Boston. The fact that he was registered as a freeman shows that he was able to bring some small fortune with him, and so had a status above the hired laborer or indentured white servant, large numbers of which came out with every company. A few years later, he was in Boston, had evidently put his substance to good account, and was the owner of a profitable grist mill, which derived its power from the rise and fall of the tides among the fens to the west of the city. He died in 1684, full of years, well-loved and worthy, as may be gathered from the Roxbury Church records, wherein he is referred to as Father Baker, and described as old and blind and godly. But while John Baker was thus prospering, accommodating himself to a larger freedom, settling himself into a groove which no baker seems to have been able to tolerate for long, the religious views of the colony were not being allowed to remain undisturbed. 3 years before John Baker reached Charlestown, there had landed in Boston one Roger Williams, a scholar of Cambridge. He came to New England not at all with the moderate hopes and demands of his fellow immigrants. He was a refugee in the fullest sense of the word, from the tyranny of Archbishop Laud, and he threw a bombshell into the settlement of Boston by insisting that religious toleration, far from being merely a matter of practical expediency, was a demand of Christian principle. In other words, he sought to defend everyone's right to think for himself and to enjoy, in so doing, the respect of his fellows. Williams was quite emphatic in the matter. He insisted that persecution for cause of conscience was most evidently and lamentably contrary to the doctrine of Christ Jesus, that no one should be bound to worship or maintain a worship against his own conscience, that the church and state should be separated, that to limit a choice of magistrates to church members was like choosing a pilot according to his plan of salvation rather than to his skill in seamanship. And finally, that the magistrate could not have and should not have any power in matters of conscience. Such a thought in the land of the last word and the final good was indeed a square peg in a round hole. But even worse than Williams was Anne Hutchinson. That a man should hold such views was bad enough, but in a woman, they were simply baffling. Moreover, Mrs. Hutchinson was clearly no fanatic, but a woman of calm judgment, of good family, of ready wit and bold spirit, as Governor Winthrop admitted in no little dejection. And yet here she was, he added, like Roger Williams, or worse. She not only insisted that the Holy Ghost dwelt in every believer, but stoutly maintained the inalienable right of private judgment in religious matters against all authority, ecclesiastical or civil. Such doctrines cut at the very roots of established Puritanism. And so, in the end, both Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson were banished. Williams was the first to go. He could not return to England, where Laud was dealing more hardly than ever with nonconformists. He had no choice but to go out into the wilds. And so, when the glory of the fall had well passed, and night brought an ominous breath of cold, he set out for the vast stretches of wooded lands, which lay then, as now, at the head of Narragansett Bay. The winter which followed was one of terrible privation. But when spring came again, he had gathered 5 companions around him, and together they founded the settlement of Providence. That was in 1636. 2 years later, Anne Hutchinson was banished and joined Williams in the Providence settlement. Thereafter, for many years, a steady stream of people who chafed under the ever-increasing intolerance of the Massachusetts clergy and landowners followed the 2 pioneers into the wilderness. They had fled to the New World from the tyranny of Charles I and Archbishop Laud. And so, when they saw the same intolerable errors taking root downwards and springing upwards all around them, they picked up and went out once more. Throughout the 17th century, the settlement of Providence, Rhode Island as it came to be, and later New Hampshire, were havens of refuge for all who could not do with the form of Massachusetts and longed for still freer and more individual life. This came to be specifically true of New Hampshire, and so it is not surprising that the Bakers ultimately found their way there. About the middle of the 18th century, a great-grandson of old Father Baker, one Joseph Baker, took the road north and settled in Suncook, now Pembroke, New Hampshire. Joseph Baker is the first of his house of whom a succinct life story is preserved. He prospered greatly. Like so many other of the pioneers in these new lands, he had a considerable knowledge of surveying. Suncook was then in territory claimed by both Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And when the dispute came up for definite settlement, Joseph Baker was employed to survey the disputed areas and to make the necessary reports. It was not an easy job, especially in such a matter where feeling was likely to run high. But Joseph Baker acquitted himself well, and later on we find him becoming a selectman, a deacon of his church, and a collector of taxes. He also made a happy and fortunate marriage to Hannah Lovewell, daughter of Captain John Lovewell, whose name, as has been seen, was a household word throughout New England as the hero of Lovewell's fight in the Indian Wars. Captain Lovewell was killed in battle, and the song of Lovewell's fight became one of the folk songs of the day. Hannah Lovewell brought Joseph Baker 200 acres of good farmland, and into his home a remarkable character. She inherited all her father's courage, and stories of her fearlessness where Indians were concerned were recounted by New England firesides long after the Indian menace had ceased. She was the mother of 11 children, and like all New England mothers of those days, her work was never done. Meanwhile, her husband was becoming a figure of some importance, not only in the little town where they lived, but in the state, or province as it was then, of his adoption. In 1758, Governor Benning Wentworth of New Hampshire appointed Joseph Baker captain of the militia. It was in those days a more than ordinary trust. The fourth and final struggle between the French and English for supremacy in North America had reached its most acute stage. The French had overrun the Ohio Valley, and this, together with the building of Fort Duquesne, where Pittsburgh now is, clearly revealed their intention to shut off the English from the Mississippi Valley and confine them to the Atlantic seaboard. New England colonists were, to an ever larger extent, taking part in these wars, and the experience thus gained was fitting them for the great struggle for independence, which, at the time when Joseph Baker received his captain's commission, was less than 20 years away. When this struggle did come, Joseph Baker marched with the rest. He was also a member of the local committee of safety and a delegate to the Provincial Congress of New Hampshire. It was probably at the close of the Revolutionary War that Joseph Baker's eldest son, also named Joseph, moved across the Merrimack River and settled in Bow. There, in the uplands, high above the river valley, he had acquired his 500 acres, and now set about the great task of clearing the land. There he married Marion Moore McNeil, ultimately Scots, both the Moores and the MacNeils had come to New England by way of Northern Ireland from the county Antrim, and they brought with them all the fire and fight in religious matters for which Ulstermen, even then, were well known. Mark Baker, Mary Baker's father, was their younger son. Meanwhile, through the years since their arrival in the New World, the Ambroses, the Good Hughs, the Lovejoys, and the Chandlers had been coming together. In sharp contrast with the Bakers, the Ambroses and the families that went to their making were a mild and peace-loving people. If the Bakers were all Michaels, the Ambroses were all Gabriels. They united, as did all New England in those days, on the basis of religion. But their approach was that of the meek rather than the mighty. It was Nathaniel Ambrose, Mary Baker's grandfather, who, after serving faithfully in the Revolutionary War, devoted all his savings from his calling as a carpenter to the building of a meeting house in Pembroke, New Hampshire. It survived for many years as the Ambrose Meeting House. Nathaniel Ambrose married Phoebe Lovejoy, whose family on both sides, the Lovejoys and the Chandlers, had for many generations enjoyed a special reputation for gentle godliness. It was of the first Chandler to arrive in New England, namely William, of whom John Eliot, his pastor, wrote that he lived a very religious and godly life, and that when he died, he left a sweet memory and savor behind him. Nathaniel Ambrose and his wife, Phoebe Lovejoy, had a daughter, Abigail, and early in the 19th century, the strangely contrasting lines of the Bakers and the Ambroses were united when this girl, Abigail Ambrose, was married to Mark Baker. To these two, Mark and Abigail Baker, was born on July 16, 1821, a little girl, the subject of this record, their sixth and last child. The old grandmother, Mark's mother, Marion Moore MacNeil that was asked to choose a name for her. She named the child Mary.